This is Will with LearnChess101.com, and I have an interesting game that was just recently played, and one of the points that it emphasizes is how you always want to focus more on achieving checkmate and capturing the king, as opposed to sometimes being distracted and capturing other pieces. So this game we're going to show today, overall was a pretty even game throughout the whole entire thing. It gets interesting at the end though. At the end of the very game, you'll see what happens, where there's kind of a choice between capturing pieces versus going for checkmate. And I think it's a really good lesson for you guys, so I hope you guys get something out of it. So I'll go through the whole game, and as I said, I'm going to go through it fairly quickly until we get to the end of it. So we start off, get this started here. All right, move our pawns out. And it's pretty basic setup, bringing out the pawns, bringing out the knights. At this point, this is actually key. You'll see they bring the bishop out here, and what it's always important to do is you never want to let them take your knight and then have to capture the bishop with the pawn here. It kind of just leaves a big gap between your pawns. It's always better to keep them together. So if anyone ever does that, I always do is I bring my bishop right there, so just in case they capture my knight, I can capture the bishop with my own bishop and keep the pawns right there on c7, b7, and a7 together. So at that point, they don't capture my knight, just continuing setting up the board. And my opponent castles right there. I bring out my other knight. And right there, I capture my knight. And this is another big reason, too, why it's really good to have this bishop here. Because right now, if that bishop wasn't there, I wouldn't be able to even move my knight if I wanted to, because then it would place my king essentially in checkmate. So I move my knight out there, and then they finally take my bishop. I'm able to capture with my queen instead of my king, preventing me from castling. And then my opponent moves my bishop here to get my knight. And you'll see here that I can't really move my knight anywhere right now. If I move it here, it'll get captured by a pawn, here captured by a pawn, here captured by a pawn, and there's a pawn there. So I move my pawn up there just to protect it, and they do capture my knight, which I capture their bishop in return. So again, they keep setting up the board, moving out their pawns, and I finally get the castle here, and capture some pawns. And this is pretty interesting here. If you see here, I moved my bishop here. It wasn't really to capture the knight. It was because if you look right there, the rook was right in place to be captured if that knight moved. Of course, my opponent noticed that, though. They moved their rook out of the way. So I moved my pawns up, and if they wanted to, they could have captured my pawn right there. And I wouldn't have actually been able to capture in return because the knight would have been protecting it from my queen, but they chose not to do that and instead moved their knight. So again, just continuing to set up the board. And at this point, the way it's looking, it's a very even game. We've each captured essentially three. They have two of my knights and a bishop, and I have two of their bishops and a knight. We each have a pawn. So it's looking like a pretty even game. Whenever this happens, what I tend to do is focus on just getting an up on a pawn. And I'm looking to do this right here at b3. And my goal essentially is to capture this pawn. And once I do, it will let me capture this pawn, and it puts me in a position to at least upgrade a pawn to a queen or gain the upper hand in this game. So at that point, my opponent kind of sees what I'm doing, and they bring a little extra protection here to the pawn. Also puts the queen in position to maybe get a chance to capture my king. So at that point, I move my king out of there just to give a little more flexibility. I didn't want to be trapped, just in case they decide to start moving their knight in. This has happened to me in the past, and fortunately, I've learned from it. So again, they move their queen in there, and there isn't really anything for the queen to do. This pawn is protected, this pawn's protected. So at this point, I'm just moving my king out here. And this can sometimes be risky to move your king that much, but in this case, it was pretty safe given that I had my queen, a rook, and a bishop all right there to protect my king. So again, they move their rook. I move my king out of the way. They capture my rook. I capture in return. And they move their rook there. Get my queen. I just move out of the way. So now at this point, again, they move the queen back here to protect that pawn. So again, that pawn is going to be a very big point of this game. And that's a lot of time in a close game like this. It really comes down to the pawns. And that's why I would say it's really, really important to protect your pawns, because in a game that's really close, that's what's going to end up making the difference. Literally one pawn will make the difference. So at this point, I'm getting ready to put myself in position to get that pawn. And now my opponent moves a little extra protection there. And of course, at this point, with a rook there, I'm not going to have my queen go in and capture a pawn and then lose my queen to a rook. So now I'm just kind of reorganizing here. Opponent moves out a pawn to let their king move if necessary. And at this point, I'm kind of just moving around. I'm not really doing anything. We're sort of both just waiting for the other person to blink. That's why I'm kind of just moving my king back and forth. And now my opponent moves their queen out a little bit. And again, now there's only that rook protecting the pawn again, which is what I want. So again, I move my king. And now my opponent moves the knight. And I just get the knight out of there just because knights, I personally think the knights are much more dangerous in a situation like this than the bishop. So I saw that as an advantage, so I just want to get rid of them. So knight sometimes can place the king in check, then capture my queen or rook, and I just did not want to deal with that. So again, we're just kind of moving around. My opponent's right here looking to capture this pawn, and I move my king to protect there, which again can be a little bit risky. And you'll see here now they move the rook there to put me in check, and I keep my king there to protect the pawn. But the thing is, again, I've got a queen and a rook right here to protect my king. So just keep in mind, sometimes it can be a little risky to move your king around that much. So just make sure that there's adequate protection to make sure your king doesn't get boxed in and placed in checkmate. So now again, my opponent moves the rook back here to make sure they're still protecting this pawn. And now I'm bringing a little extra protection here. I want my rook there to provide a little extra protection here just in case I need it. As you learn in chess, you always want to be playing a couple moves ahead. The more you play, the better at this you get. So again, there you go. My opponent moves their rook there, and they're looking to attack right here. So at that point, I move my pawn up to just kind of take that out. Now, one thing that does happen is I do open up right here on the diagonal. My king basically can't move any of these places now. But at the end of the day, again, it's not too big of a, won't be too big of a deal in the game just because I have G8 and H8 to move to, and I have my queen and my rook right there in case I'll need them. So now my opponent's moving the queen in, hopefully just trying to limit the places I can move. Maybe even trying to capture this piece right here. But again, I have my rook there, so I'm protected. So now at this point, I'm getting ready to capture the pawn. It's all looking like it's coming together pretty nicely. And now my opponent's getting ready to hopefully place me in checkmate. I wasn't quite sure what they were trying to do there, maybe just get something going. And at that point, I take the pawn. So now again, my opponent, if they were to move the rook here, it wouldn't make sense because I had my queen there would capture the rook. Then my opponent's queen would capture mine, and then my king would capture the queen. So essentially, they'd just be sacrificing the rook. So at that point, they move the queen, and then I capture the rook because I got the one pawn that I wanted. And at this point, it'd be pretty simple for me to win the game as long as I just play it, fairly smart. So now I move my queen in. I'm getting ready to take some more pawns, and my opponent's essentially just doing the same thing. I take another pawn here. My opponent puts me in check, and they keep putting me in check. And at this point, I'm pretty safe. So now my opponent takes one of my pawns. I move my queen, and this is where it gets interesting, because you'll see we're essentially off to the races. I'm moving my pawn up, they're moving their pawn up. I move my pawn up, they move their pawn up. And it's going to get interesting here, because you're going to see something that happens that, especially if you're a newer player, you may not even think to do. So again, I move my pawn up, and they put me in check to protect that pawn when it becomes a queen. I move out of the way, now they have a queen. Now this is where it gets interesting, because I know a lot of players instinctively would just capture this queen, and then they would capture theirs, and then promote this queen. It would be one queen against one queen. But this is where it gets interesting, because if you look here, I'm one move away from putting them in check, the king in check. And if you can read the board, there isn't much my opponent can do once I do this. So you'll see, watch, I put them in check, and he has to move the king, And now with my other queen, I put him in check, and these two queens can't capture the queen. So now he has to one move, which is to put that pawn up there, and then boom, checkmate. So what I really liked about this game, as I said, nothing too necessarily exciting happens throughout the whole game. A lot of it was just basically trying to capture that one pawn. But again, what was interesting here, I'll play back again, is just when my opponent got a queen, I basically just ignored it. You know, I don't focus on the two queens my opponent has, and instead I'm just focused on getting checkmate. I mean, if I were to capture that queen, or if you were to do the same thing in this situation, chances are it would still result in a checkmate. But again, it's always better just to end the game when you can. And this is why it's always good to look a few moves ahead. This wasn't something impulsive. I made sure that everything panned out. A lot of times when I was learning how to play, I would try something like this, and I would miss something, and then I'd end up losing the game. So again, let's put him in check, moves out of the way, check again. And I knew he had to move that pawn. So I saw this whole thing out a couple moves ahead, and checkmate. My opponent's just there with two queens, but it didn't matter. So again, that's the whole game. Hope you guys learned something. If you are looking to learn a little bit more, we do have our ebook, the Chess Formula, which teaches the top tricks and moves in chess. It's not an incredibly long book, but it will teach you a lot of moves that could help you in a game like this, and essentially teaches you the same moves that you can use to either win the game or prevent yourself from losing. It's both teaches offense and defense at the same time. So if you have any comments about this, anything you notice, feel free to leave it in the comments section. And thanks again for watching. This is LearnChess101.com.